The telephone call came to the Kremlin at 4 in the morning on October 16, 1941, and the duty officer who took it understood immediately that the information required Stalin's personal attention regardless of the hour. German panzer units had been sighted at Kalinin, barely 100 miles northwest of Moscow. Wehrmacht reconnaissance elements were reported even closer. The defensive lines that were supposed to hold the Germans at distance had been penetrated or bypassed. Moscow itself was now directly threatened. Joseph Stalin had been awake, as he often was in these pre-dawn hours, reviewing reports from fronts that stretched from Leningrad to the Crimea. 4 months into Operation Barbarossa, the strategic situation had deteriorated beyond anything Soviet planning had anticipated. Entire armies had been encircled and destroyed. Millions of soldiers were dead or captured. German forces had advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. But Moscow had remained secure, protected by distance and by armies that would surely halt the German advance before it reached the capital. Now those assumptions were being tested by reports that suggested the protective buffer around Moscow was collapsing. Stalin summoned his inner circle, Molotov, Beria, and members of the State Defense Committee, for an emergency session to assess whether the capital itself was about to fall. The meeting began with military briefings that painted a picture more dire than even pessimistic assessments had suggested. General Georgy Zhukov, recently appointed to command the Western Front defending Moscow, presented the tactical situation with brutal honesty. German Army Group Center had launched a massive offensive in early October, Operation Typhoon, aimed directly at Moscow. The attacks had achieved breakthrough in multiple sectors. Soviet forces were retreating in disorder. The Vyazma pocket had trapped several armies. German advance elements were now within artillery range of Moscow's outer suburbs. The defensive situation was critical and deteriorating hourly. Stalin listened with the controlled fury that those who knew him had learned to recognize as more dangerous than explosive rage. The question he asked was fundamental. Could Moscow be held? Zhukov's response was careful but clear. Moscow could be defended if reinforcements arrived in time, if the population mobilized for urban defense, if weather conditions deteriorated to slow German armor. But the margin was thin. Days mattered, perhaps hours. The Germans were close enough that their artillery could already shell the city's outskirts. The political implications of Moscow's fall extended beyond military defeat. Moscow was not just the capital, but the symbolic heart of the Soviet Union. Stalin's authority was tied to Moscow. The government apparatus was centered there. If Moscow fell, what remained of Soviet resistance might fragment into isolated pockets without central coordination. The psychological impact on Soviet forces and civilians would be catastrophic. More fundamentally, Moscow's fall might convince remaining allies that Soviet defeat was inevitable and negotiated settlement was preferable to continued resistance. Major Dmitry Volkov commanded an NKVD security battalion hastily positioned to defend approaches to Moscow, and his experience illustrated the desperation of the defensive measures being implemented. His unit consisted of factory workers given rifles and minimal training, NKVD personnel pulled from administrative duties, and a handful of experienced soldiers recovered from hospitals. They occupied positions in villages that German advance elements might reach within hours. Their orders were to hold regardless of cost, to delay German armor long enough for regular forces to establish defensive lines. Volkov understood that his battalion was a sacrificial deployment, positioned to be destroyed, buying time measured in hours rather than days. But the orders came directly from Moscow command, and in October 1941, questioning orders meant execution. His men dug positions in frozen ground, distributed ammunition that was inadequate for sustained combat, and waited for German tanks that would almost certainly overwhelm their hasty defenses. In the Kremlin, Stalin confronted a decision that went to the core of Soviet survival. Should the government evacuate Moscow, relocating to cities farther east where German armies could not immediately reach? The practical arguments for evacuation were compelling. Government functions could continue from Kuibyshev or beyond the Urals. Leadership would be preserved. If Moscow fell, Soviet authority would survive to continue the war. But evacuation also signaled doubt about Moscow's defense, might trigger panic among troops and civilians, could be interpreted as abandonment. The evacuation of government agencies and critical industries had already begun, conducted quietly to avoid public alarm. Trains departed Moscow, carrying documents, equipment, and personnel considered essential to continued resistance. But Stalin himself had not decided whether to leave. And without that decision, the senior leadership remained in Moscow, caught between the threat of German capture and the political necessity of demonstrating confidence in the city's defense. Reports continued arriving through October 16th, detailing the scope of the crisis. German forces were advancing on multiple axes toward Moscow. The Mozhaisk defensive line, which was supposed to provide layered defense, was being penetrated. Roads leading east from Moscow were clogged with refugees and retreating military units. Panic was spreading through Moscow's population as rumors of German proximity circulated despite official censorship. The situation was approaching the point where organized defense might give way to chaotic collapse. Stalin made several decisions that morning that would shape Moscow's defense. First, Zhukov would have complete authority to organize the defense, with resources prioritized to his command. Second, NKVD units would establish blocking positions behind frontline forces to prevent unauthorized retreat. Soldiers who fell back without orders would be shot. Third, the state of siege would be declared in Moscow, with martial law and restrictions on movement. Fourth, and most critically, Stalin would remain in Moscow. The decision to stay was both political calculation and personal commitment. If Stalin fled, resistance might crumble. If he stayed and Moscow fell, he would likely be killed or captured. The decision to remain in the capital under direct threat was perhaps the most significant choice Stalin made during the entire war. The announcement that Stalin was staying in Moscow had immediate psychological impact. Troops who might have continued retreating instead stabilized defensive positions. Civilians who were preparing to flee instead reported for civil defense duties. The NKVD began arresting and executing looters and defeatists, creating atmosphere of enforced order that replaced spreading panic. Moscow would be defended, and the presence of Stalin guaranteed that the defense would be total. Volkov's battalion engaged German reconnaissance units on October 17th in a brief, savage firefight that destroyed most of his force but delayed the German advance for several hours. Volkov survived and was pulled back to new positions closer to Moscow, where his depleted unit was integrated into a composite regiment drawn from security forces, factory militia, and military academy cadets. The regiment occupied positions in Moscow's outer suburbs, quite literally the last organized force between German armor and the city center. The weather, which had been dry and favorable for mobile operations, began deteriorating in late October. Rain turned roads to mud. Temperatures dropped. German supply lines, already stretched by the advance, struggled to deliver fuel and ammunition. The pace of the German advance slowed from dozens of kilometers per day to hard-won meters. The delay gave Soviet forces time to rush reinforcements to Moscow from Siberian military districts, time to organize defensive positions, time to transform the battle from pursuit into siege. Zhukov used the breathing space to construct layered defenses around Moscow. Inner rings were established using barriers, anti-tank ditches, and fortified buildings. Artillery was positioned to cover approaches. Reserves were held for counterattacks. The Red Army units arriving from the east were deployed to strengthen sectors where German pressure was greatest. Moscow's defense was being improvised from whatever forces could be assembled, but the improvisation was being conducted by a commander who understood urban warfare and had authority to implement his plans without political interference. Stalin's presence in Moscow during the November 7th Revolution Day parade became symbolic demonstration of defiance. With German forces so close that artillery fire could be heard in the distance, Stalin stood atop Lenin's mausoleum, reviewing troops who marched through Red Square and then departed directly for the front lines. The parade was propaganda theater, but it was effective theater. It demonstrated that Moscow had not fallen, that Soviet authority remained intact, that resistance would continue regardless of German proximity. The German offensive renewed in mid-November as roads froze and armor regained mobility. Wehrmacht units pushed to within 15 miles of Moscow's center, close enough that officers with binoculars could see the city's buildings. For weeks that stretched into early December, the battle hung in balance. German forces trying to achieve final breakthrough, Soviet defenders holding positions through casualties that would have broken less desperate resistance. Volkov's regiment fought in Khimki, a suburb so close to Moscow that the Kremlin towers were visible from defensive positions. His unit held a factory complex against German infantry supported by tanks, fighting room to room, floor by floor, until the building was a ruin held by survivors who measured success by preventing German advance rather than by holding intact positions. When relief finally arrived, Volkov's regiment had ceased to exist as organized unit. Survivors were consolidated into other formations, and the regiment's number was assigned to a new unit being formed from fresh conscripts. By early December, the German offensive had exhausted itself. Wehrmacht units were strung out, undersupplied, depleted by casualties and frostbite. The Red Army, meanwhile, had accumulated reserves from eastern military districts, fresh divisions equipped for winter warfare. On December 5th, Zhukov launched counteroffensives that pushed German forces back from Moscow's immediate approaches. The counterattacks did not destroy Army Group Center, but they ended the immediate threat to Moscow and transformed the strategic situation from desperate defense to limited offensive action. Stalin's decision to remain in Moscow during the crisis became foundational to the narrative of Soviet resistance. Had he evacuated, the psychological impact might have been catastrophic, even if Moscow was ultimately held. By staying, he tied his personal authority to the city's defense and demonstrated commitment that inspired resistance throughout the command structure. Whether this was calculated strategy or personal obstinacy matters less than the effect. Moscow's defense stiffened when Stalin's presence signaled that retreat was not an option. The battle for Moscow continued through winter, but the crisis moment had passed. German forces would threaten other Soviet cities, would advance deep into the Caucasus and reach Stalingrad, but they would never again come as close to capturing the Soviet capital as they did in October and November 1941. The decision to defend Moscow rather than evacuate, to rush reinforcements despite risks elsewhere, to hold the city regardless of cost, these decisions, made when German reconnaissance units were literally at Moscow's gates, determined that Soviet resistance would continue organized around a capital that remained in Soviet hands. For Stalin, the Moscow crisis represented a moment when his personal fate and the Soviet state's survival were completely aligned. If Moscow fell with him in it, both he and the system he ruled would likely perish. If Moscow held, his authority would be reinforced, and Soviet resistance would have a center from which to organize. The decision to stay was therefore both supremely risky and strategically essential. He chose to gamble his survival on Moscow's defense, and the gamble succeeded. Volkov survived the winter battles and continued fighting through the war's remainder. His experience at Moscow's gates, holding positions against German forces so close to the city that retreat meant abandoning the capital, was replicated by thousands of Soviet soldiers who fought in positions where losing meant the war might be lost. That they held, that Moscow remained Soviet, that German forces were eventually pushed back. These outcomes were not inevitable in October 1941, when Stalin learned the Germans were at Moscow's gates. The telephone call at 4 in the morning had announced a crisis that threatened the Soviet Union's existence. The decisions made in response, to defend rather than evacuate, to commit reserves despite risks, to hold at all costs, determined that the crisis would be survived. Stalin learned the Germans were at Moscow's gates and chose to remain behind those gates, to defend the capital personally, to tie his authority to its survival. Moscow held, and with it, Soviet resistance continued, centered on a capital that German forces had reached but could not capture.